Hello guys, and welcome back to Sociocultural Webinar. So if we pick up then, having a look at this idea of potential synoptic questions. So if we have a look here, we've got part 1, Sport Society, as I mentioned previously on Webinar 3. What we've got then, when you have a 10-mark question in sociocultural issues, there's a good chance that they're going to pick a social and cultural factor that kind of transcends through through the time periods here, and then you're going to have to apply it to a sociocultural issue or a contemporary issue in modern sport. And as I said previously, what better way to link it than this idea of the change in law and order in 21st century Britain? I mean, it's a huge change really from 20th century and massive change from 1850. Okay, so what we have to have an understanding is using examples, explain how law and order impacted sport. Okay, and then we have to look into this idea of as law and order, drugs in sport is against the law. Spectator violence is against the law. Any violence is against the law. So you look at these two things and think, right, this is how the good side of law and order in 21st century Britain, but can we then have a look at it and start to think about evaluating the strategies that are being used to try and prevent these kind of deviant behaviours? Okay, so I'll put it onto here now. I mean, I don't know what part 1 will be specifically. I put here, explaining influence of law and order in shaping the characteristics of sport in pre-industrial Britain compared to 21st century Britain. In hindsight, that's probably a little bit too much. I think it's a good comparison, nice and easy one, but what you're more likely to have to do is to talk about this idea of 21st century Britain law and order, and then moving on to drugs and violence, as you can see here. So you might be asked to evaluate strategies to prevent spectator violence, or you could be asked to evaluate strategies used to prevent doping in sport. Now, that is a good, definite link. You could have a look through from this. So if I just take you through that then, let's have a look. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move through these now. I'll just show you law and order first up. So if you have a look at law and order going through the ages, this can show you how it would work. So pre-industrial Britain then, we had activities that were cruel, violent, and involved wagering. Now, this was due to the fact that there was a lack of law and order. No RSPCA, activities were cruel. No police, violent. No police meant the wagering. Make sure you can give example there, or prize fighting you could put on top of that. On top of that, of course, going into post-1850 Britain, you can see that law and order started to become more prevalent now. So what we had was the police force, and we had the RSPCA. Of course, these two things stopped or outlawed a lot of kind of violent and such as cockfighting and bare knuckle fighting. These type of things were kind of outlawed. Mob football was outlawed, and what we had then in society, it became non-violent and civilized. For example, things such as lawn tennis started to become popular with middle-class people, and then on top of that we had respectable, so things such as association football, and of course this idea of things becoming non-violent, civilized and respectable had a massive link to kind of public school boys with regard to them leaving and trying to transfer that kind of idea of muscular Christianity to society via the factories, churches, etc. So, I'll put it onto here, onto there. Then you look into 20th century Britain, and we have a look at how law and order changed then. Okay, so law and order in 20th century Britain, a number of things really. I suppose there was pretty much now all kind of violent or cruel activities such as cockfighting, that they were pretty much outlawed. Now they were gone. But what we did have now in 20th century Britain was this idea of doping and hooliganism becoming more prevalent. So things within law and order were starting to shift. So you had doping scandals with regard to Eastern Bloc countries. We had hooliganism, certainly in Britain, was very, very prevalent. So these are the type of things that started to emerge in 20th century. But as with all of 20th century Britain, it was a bit of a transition era where we then look into kind of 21st century Britain. Now, if I showed you, have a look down there, this is absolutely huge with regard, and I've already been through it on webinar 2 or 3, so you have a look at this and think, these are examples of how 21st century Britain has attempted to make law and order a kind of the catalyst for sporting change, really. So what we've got then, these are the things. I mean, you could add extra examples here. I'm sure you've got them. So you're looking down here thinking fair. I mean, you could also talk about, anti-doping, for example, World Anti-Doping Association are examples there. Safe. I mean, obviously, that's a really good example there. Equal. So you've got this example here, sex discrimination. acts, and certainly sex discrimination cases with regard to the Chelsea physio Eva Cadero, who sued Chelsea with regard to sexual discrimination from Jose Mourinho, less violent in 21st century Britain. And this is kind of an idea. It could be less violent due to violence on the pitch being punished with prison sentences. And there's a good example there, Duncan Ferguson from Everton Football Club headbutting someone and getting put into prison. Court of Arbitration for Sport, okay, was also is an example of law and order, and this is used as appeals court usually for people who feel that they've been given harsh sentences and therefore they can appeal. For example, Russian athletes who are not Russian athletes were banned from Rio Olympics. However, the athletes who were not this was for the whole of the Russian athletes, but the Russian athletes who were not guilty of doping appealed, and they could then take part, but not under the Russian flag. So there's an example there of how the Court of Arbitration in sport can be as an idea of law and order. It's the highest court for sport. So if you have a look at that, they are examples. I don't know where it's going to come from, but I think most likely you're going to get 21st century Britain kind of part one to your 10-mark questions. If you have a look back onto here, so we look at this bit here, using examples. It could be any part from there, but I imagine it's more likely to be 21st century Britain because it gives you so many examples there. But of course, it was a comparison. It's a nice, easy one to compare. So that's what we're looking for. I think this bit here, what we need to do then, if we've had a look at that, what I'm going to do now is, because we've kind of, if I just go back actually one, if we have a look at this, I'm not going to go through the whole of violence. I'm not going to go through the whole of doping. What I'm going to do is just kind of go through these strategies where you can demonstrate your evaluation skills, because that is going to separate the kind of students who are getting 7s, 6s, and the students who are getting 9s and 10s. And let's be honest, you know, if we're looking at this from a point of view, paper 1, the evaluation section on injuries, you know, contrast there was very, very difficult to access. So it's really important that you have a good idea of how you're going to evaluate if you're asked to in the 10-mark question for sociocultural. So let's have a look then. Violence in sport. Now this is what you'd have to know. It's worth saying that, you know, you've got to split it into player violence causes and spectator violence causes. Then you've got to have strategies to prevent. Now, and these implications are massively important. Huge likelihood of a 2-mark question for these. But if I said to you now, it's this section, you must revise it all. There was one question on violence last year. It's a 2-mark question based upon causes of spectator violence. Nothing else came up. So really important area to make sure we've revised as a full. You all have the revision packs, so you can have a look through those. I'm just going to flick through these now. So obviously, if you want to pause it and make notes, I'm assuming if you're taught by me in any way, then you will have had the revision packs. So if we go on from there, if I just go through, let's have a look then. So we've got our spectator violence here, causes and preventative strategies, and the big one then. So what we're going to need to do then is this. If we have got certain strategies, if we are going to evaluate them, strategies to prevent spectator violence, you could use these. So you can have banning orders, all-seater stadia, CCTV, alcohol control, police and segregation. That is the identification of strategies that have been used to try and prevent spectator violence. Now, of course, banning orders. So if we give an example, for example, lifetime bans. Now, what you have is, for example, England football England football hooligans in kind of, let's say, 2003-4 were given kind of banning orders to stop them from travelling. So that will be an example of that. At the top of that, you've got all-seater stadium, help with crowd safety. CCTV, you know, is a way, a technological way to prevent violence for inside and outside the ground. And of course, the good thing about that is that you can lead to kind of retrospective banning orders, as we've looked at here. Alcohol control. Football, for example, has made a big effort to try and reduce the time periods by which you can drink alcohol. For example, constantly what I'm trying to do here is give you, for example, you're saying here like 45 minutes before a game you can get alcohol at the ground, and then you can get it for 15 minutes at half time, but that is it. On top of that, you've got policing. So for example now, particularly after the Jack Grealish case, there's been a massive call for increased policing. So now what we're looking for, increased policing and more qualified stewards. Okay, so trained stewards to prevent kind of violence. So this is an example there. So more policing. On top of this, segregation. So there's been a big effort by football teams to make sure they segregate or split or separate home and away fans to prevent these kind of volatile situations from emerging. Now, if these are these kind of strategies to prevent spectator violence, what we need to be able to do now, and try and give yourself examples as much as you can, when you've got them, of course, this opens us up for evaluation, because although these are strategies that are all well and good, the problem, although spectator violence is definitely less so than it was. I mean, I'm recording this at the time now where England fans have kind of been disgraced again in Portugal, and you see this situation in that. So what is there? We need to give the criticisms to say why it's not working. Okay, so why are these things not working? So if you say from this, banning orders or lifetime bans from football is not enough to stop people from being violent. Okay, violence in the street would lead to a prison sentence. So I think it's just as important if we're really going to try and make sure that I think that there should be prison sentences. They're only effective if it's prison sentences. For example, Aston Villa fan who came on, not Aston Villa fan, sorry, Birmingham City fan who came on, just changed that, Birmingham City fan coming onto the pitch and hitting Jack Grealish, for example, got a prison sentence. That is the type of things we need to make sure that are going to allow us to kind of alleviate maybe spectator violence. On top of that, CCTV. Yes, the strengths are that you can use technology to get retrospective punishments and banning orders. However, there are massive cost implications for this kind of technology, so it can be very expensive. Now, alcohol control. So what we're saying then, the strength of alcohol control is good, because what they're doing is they are reducing the time period of which people can drink at football games. However, huge evaluation point here. The media control kickoff times. Okay, so sometimes the media control of kickoff times means that you're having FA Cup ties, Wolves versus Manchester United, for example, this year, 8 p.m. on a Saturday. And that is just encouraging people to drink alcohol all day. Okay, and if they do that, of course, there is way more likely their inhibitions are going to be lowered, therefore more chance of violence. So this is a problem with. It's all very well saying alcohol control, but this is something that prevents that to be a really safe strategy. On from there, policing. So that strength was, we said we want to increase policing. That's good because it might decrease the chance. However, it's a cost. It's a huge cost for the club who are policing the game. For example, if it was Birmingham City, they would have to kind of police the game. They pay some money towards it. But of course, all those extra police working at football grounds, this costs the taxpayer money as well. So that's something to consider. So hopefully you can see that. That will be one way you could do that. So that is linked into violence. So that will give you a good way of saying however. And make sure wherever I've got an arrow here, you have the word however to demonstrate that you are evaluating this idea of strategies to prevent spectator violence. Now, if we move on to drugs then, drugs in sport is an absolutely huge topic for this exam because it has not come up at all. And what we have to do, I mean, I look at this. This is a huge chance of a kind of legal supplements versus illegal drugs and doping. This is a huge like little 2 marker will come in with that. Could be more, but more likely to be a 2 marker there. On top of that, reasons why people use it, again, could be into a 2 marker. And then you get into the big ones down here. This often opens it up a little bit more. So what I'm going to do is just kind of, again, put this on if you want to pause it. Obviously, a nice little revision of ergogenic aids, as they were absolutely redundant in the A-level exam. So physiological factors, so maybe you might get to use them in this one. On top of this, you've got these ideas here. These are the reasons why. Nice to split them into categories there, just to make sure you've got enough stuff to talk about. These are consequences or implications on society, sport, performer. Make sure you can separate those. And let's get to the nitty-gritty then. So let's get to the points that we really want to make sure we can do. So we've got to be able to evaluate strategies to prevent doping in sport. So let's see it like this then. So if we look at it, if you're trying to remember it, strategies to prevent doping in sport, athletes can study a WADA B Tech. Now that links into WADA, World Anti-Doping Association, bans, testing, education, counterculture. It's supposed to link because a B Tech is obviously an education program, and then if you consider the people who would run it, it'd be World Anti-Doping Association. Now this is not a thing. This is just a memory method. So once you've got that in, the absolute key on this is, yes, we need all of it, but testing, 1, 2, 3. Do not forget that there are 3 testing points, and they are absolutely vital, both for the positive strategy and then the negative for the evaluation. So please keep an eye on that. So let's start off then. Let's have a look. So what we've got, World Anti-Doping Association is the first strategy used to prevent doping because they draw up a list of banned substances. Okay, first one. Now let's go to bans. So one of the ways you can do it is bans. So lifetime bans to act as a deterrent to doping. Okay, so for example, you might see the odd example of that. So Lance Armstrong, for example, is currently not allowed. I don't think it's lifetime, but certainly that could be an example used there. Now on top of this, we've got this idea then if we get into testing. So everything I talk about now under lifetime bans, we are now talking about testing, and testing is absolutely huge. So strategies to prevent doping in sport via testing, we have this idea of the Adams Initiative. So this is in and out of competition testing, and it involves knowing the athlete's whereabouts 2 hours a day for 24/7. So athletes at the top level, for example, you could go back to someone like Mo Farah, they have to show their whereabouts 2 hours of every day, and that is when they can be tested at absolutely any time in the year. So they have to let people know about that. That's a fantastic initiative to try and do that. On top of that testing, we have retrospective testing. So now blood and urine samples are stored in World Anti-Doping Association labs, so they can be tested after an event, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 8 years, 12 years. And you look now, you're still seeing athletes at this point getting medals 12 years after they competed, because the storing of blood and urine samples has allowed them to find the kind of drugs that were not detectable at that point. On top of this, biological passports is another example of testing. So if we have a passport to travel to go on holiday, athletes have a passport with their biological values, for example, red blood cell count, EPO content in their kind of body. So they would have these passports, and this is looked for to test. There is a normal range. They are looking for abnormal ranges to show where people might be doping, which can allow further tests to take place. Education-wise, we have drug education for performance, for example, 100% Me as an example there. So I think that's coming from UK Sport. So 100% Me, drug education program, making sure you know everything that's in your body. On top of that, you've got counterculture here, so you've got the drug Olympics. Okay, so what this means, you don't think about kind of doing the right thing. You just think, right, let's counter this, and we have a culture here where you're saying, right, rather than trying to prevent it, let's just go with it and let people have a drug Olympics and a non-doping Olympics. So you've got that in there. That is an example of the most radical way to try and alleviate this problem of doping in sport. So that would be an example of that. As you can see, you've got plenty to write about here. But of course, we have to be able to consider how to evaluate these strategies, and this would be the thing that majority of people would struggle to do. So if you can do this, it just allows you to kind of really demonstrate high-level kind of responses. So let's have a look. So starting off then, okay, we've got the World Anti-Doping Association, which draws up a list of banned substances. However, what we also have is the Court for Arbitration in Sport, and this is the court where the highest court in sport, and they can overturn life bans. For example, Dwayne Chambers, British sprinter, was banned for life, but appealed, and then that meant that he could take part. So this is always a problem. I don't want to go in massive detail to this, but Court for Arbitration in Sport would say that you can't give a life ban for something like this, because once people are learned and they've had education, they should be able to come back as people who are killers. If you're put down for murder, you could still come out of prison. So it's not fair to ban people for life. That's their point. Obviously, with this whole process of appealing and no lifetime bans really being given is the reason why drugs and doping will never be outlawed, because until it's a lifetime ban, how are you ever going to stop it? So on top of that, so that's one good evaluation point there. Let's have a look at the next one. Adams Initiative then. Tested in and out of competition, knowing athletes' whereabouts 2 hours a day. Right. All very well saying testing in and out of competition, all very well storing kind of samples. The big problem is that it's all very well doing this testing, but if the government or the state are sponsoring doping, then there are obviously massive issues. Anybody who's watched the Icarus documentary will have real good knowledge of this idea here. State-sponsored doping, e.g. Russia, makes it impossible to kind of prevent doping because the testing is redundant almost. Okay, going on from there, if we go on from here, we have retrospective testing. We've said about that. holding it, great. People getting medals 12 years later. But let's be honest, athletes who lose the opportunity to get a gold, silver or bronze not only lose the instant gratification that you get from having these medals, but on top of that, they lose sponsorship at the times. This means that might stop them from taking part. If they lose sponsorship and UK sport, if they were British, for example, UK sport funding because doped athletes finished ahead of them, it's irrelevant that they're getting a medal. Their whole career is ruined because of this idea here. So retrospective testing is great, it's needed, but it doesn't help cheated athletes because they don't get the instant gratification, plus they lose funding, sponsorship, etc. Going on from there then. If we go down to this bit, so you've got kind of biological passports, you've got this testing, retrospective, you've got Adams Initiative, but the flip side to all this testing is that athletes can still miss 3 tests. Okay, so it's only after they've missed their 3rd test that they're banned. So this in itself is saying that you can miss tests, but you can still compete until you've missed 3. So that again says, all right, we've got all this excellent testing stuff here, but that is an issue, isn't it? So you can say that's an evaluate or negative kind of point behind testing. Now, if we go on from here, we've got this idea of kind of biological passports, as I said, into here. So you've got this bit here to test for abnormalities. But the big problem with this is there are undetectable drugs. Okay, so the technology of creating drugs is ahead of the technology of testing drugs, as you'll know from technology in sport. And you look at this as examples of this. THG in the 1990s was an example of a designer steroid that was undetectable. So on top of that, human growth hormone, late 90s, early 2000s, and you look at that, it was very difficult to detect this, therefore people were abusing it. Now, if we go on from here, the final evaluation point, we'll be looking at this idea of drug Olympics. Obviously, there are extreme ethical and moral dilemmas behind the idea of a drug Olympics, and particular focus on health risks there. So hopefully you can see how you would use that as a way of kind of evaluating. Now, obviously, it could be drugs or violence as part 2 of that. And I feel like, it gives you this kind of... it's got more depth to it than any of the other parts of violence and doping, so it's a good one to make sure you're aware of. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly go on then. This is the other unexamined area for modern technology in sport. So when we're looking at this then, if you ask a question on modern technology, I think, there's a huge likelihood that you're going to get entertainment. Okay, so impact or evaluate the impact of technology on entertainment. Now, when this comes up, it's a good way to remember this is my, I suppose, punditry hero, Gary Neville. If you have a look at him here, I watched this 7 o'clock Monday Night Football, absolute favourite show. Now, let's go in. So if you're trying to remember this and you're trying to use it, when you're thinking about how modern technology increases entertainment, you can use my punditry hero, Gary Neville, and talk about it like this. Gary Neville analyses multiple camera angles and slow motion replays. So if you think of it there, you can have a look, watch some YouTube clips if you want. I've got plenty of links if you want them. And you look down here and think, right, this translates to entertainment is increased due to punditry, and you get educated in a sport. On top of that, analyzes turns into there's improved analysis. Okay, so people looking at strengths and weaknesses using kind of motion pictures and moving things around on the kind of on the projectors here. On top of that, you get multiple camera angles. There's a really good example of kind of I think it was Lionel Messi's free kick against Liverpool, and there's on YouTube, if you search it, I think it's like 12 angles of Messi's free kick versus Liverpool, and you can get all these different camera angles. And people who like sport like to watch these things from lots of different angles because it entertains them, they enjoy it. On top of this, you have things such as slow motion technology, and I think you look at that, it's entertaining. If you are interested in impact sports such as rugby, it's nothing better than watching a really good tackle in slow motion. Boxing, for example, you watch a knockout, you watch that slow, and you can really appreciate the quality of the punch, or you might just be one of those people who likes watching people get hurt. On top of that, you have action replays. Okay, so this means, and it's a huge development in technology from the kind of 70s, 60s. If you watched football in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and you missed a goal, that was it. It's game over. You're never watching that goal. So action replays mean that you can actually rewatch any little bits that you might have missed if you were distracted, for example. And of course, this idea of technological entertainment, it's huge. I mean, a lot of people like watching the technology before and after the games more than they actually like watching the games. So what I would say to you is technology enhances entertainment when you're watching before and after. But, okay, so what is the downside to entertainment? Okay, so what the downside is that it can interrupt and delay the game. So sometimes you get things such as, I don't know, people showing replays and you can miss the parts of the game you find interesting. On top of that, you can have reduced live attendances, and I've got to be honest, I'm guilty of that. You look at it and think watching sport on TV now is so good. It really is. And that can actually stop people from wanting to actually go and watch the games. I put that on just because that is a huge potential link as a 4 or 5 mark question, so make sure you can differentiate between how it increased entertainment, but how also it could decrease entertainment. Okay, so that's that. Hopefully you feel okay with that. Thank you very much.